Hello. Today we're going to talk about a very important man and the movies that he made in the 1960s and 1970. The man is Herschell Gordon Lewis, the first director to put explicit gore in a movie just for the sake of putting explicit gore in a movie and also for the sake of getting people to sit in the seats. So, Herschell Gordon Lewis is really more of a businessman than an artist. He's actually not an artist at all. In fact, in an interview, when addressing the idea of being an artist, he said, "Have you seen the movie?" So here's Herschell Gordon Lewis as a younger man. And here is the first and most notorious horror movie that Herschell Gordon Lewis has directed. It's called Blood Feast. Blood Feast is about, it's about a feast, an Egyptian feast, where the food being consumed and prepared is people. The way Blood Feast came about is that Herschell Gordon Lewis was making other movies to try and make some money. The movies were mostly nudist camp movies, which were making money at the time because you couldn't really put nudity in a real movie, in a Hollywood movie. You couldn't put sex in a movie because of the censors. So he was making nudist camp movies and making money off that because people wanted to see naked bodies, which makes sense. Anyway, after a while, everyone kept making these movies, and so there was too much competition and saturation within the nudist movie market. So Herschell Gordon Lewis decided that he would make a gore movie. So, why is this movie Egyptian in theme? It's because Herschell was already staying in an Egyptian-themed hotel to make these other movies. So they basically just took a picture of this cheap 6-foot-tall Sphinx and a few other Egyptian-themed things, and they made the movie. The movie itself is quite bad, except it's extremely important because there is so much disgusting gore in it, and it's mostly, I believe, made out of sheep, or I think it's sheep's organs. So unlike later, like in the 80s and the 2000s, when there's tons of gore made out of what I assume to be synthetic materials, here we have actual animal organs making up all of the gore, and I think they used some kind of medicine and dye to make the blood, and the medicine was like stomach medicine, like diarrhea medicine. The craziest part of this movie is probably when they rip a girl's tongue out. It's like a giant sheep's tongue that I think had been kicking around the set for a while and was rancid. They actually soaked it in pine salt to mask the smell and taste of it. And this girl had this thing in her mouth. The movie is really gross. The acting is really bad. But as we know, there was so much gore in it and no one had ever seen anything like that, so it did extremely well. It actually got banned all over the country after running for a few days because no one really expected it to be so explicit. So, since it did really well, Herschell and producer David Friedman worked together to make a second movie called 2000 Maniacs. Now, in my opinion, and probably most people's opinions, this is the best Herschell Gordon Lewis film. It's his favorite film. It wasn't as successful as Blood Feast, but the plot is more fun. The effects look better and actually less disgusting. And this kicked off a whole string of movies that were influenced by it. So, the idea of this one is that there's this town that appears 100 years after the Civil War ends, which would put us in 1965 when it was made. It appears in Georgia, and people here want to get revenge on the North. So some Northerners come down, and these Southerners trick them into thinking they're guests of honor. They put them up in a hotel. I think there's, it's been a while since I watched it, but I think there's 6 of them. Maybe it's 4. It's 4 or 6 Northerners. They get put up in a hotel, and one by one, the Southerners kill them in crazy carnival game type ways. Actually, one girl gets her thumb and arm cut off, and another woman gets smashed by a giant rock that they use a dunk tank to prop up this rock, and they put the woman below. They drop the rock down and smash her. Then they put a guy in a barrel and put a bunch of spikes through the barrel, roll him down a hill. All sorts of interesting and creative ways to have gore instead of just like ripping someone's organs out. I liked it a lot, and it's got the whole North versus South thing, and it's got the whole trope of people getting lost on a trip and then the locals terrorizing them. You can see this later in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You can see it in The Hills Have Eyes. You can see it in Tourist Trap. You can see it in Motel Hell. You can see it in all sorts of things. And in all sorts of movies take this idea. And really they owe a lot to 2000 Maniacs. Now, we already talked about multiple Maniacs that John Waters did, and he definitely named his movie after this one. There's also a sequel, which I'm not sure if it's an official sequel or not. I haven't watched it. It's called 2001 Maniacs. Herschell Gordon Lewis was not involved, but I'll have to get my hands on that one at some point. So after 2000 Maniacs, Friedman and Lewis. Oh, actually, I got to talk about this one real quick. This is a terrible movie, and it is not a gore movie, although I don't know for sure because I could not get through it. Monster Go-Go was a movie. I think the director was Bill Rebane, and he never finished it. So Herschell Gordon Lewis just bought it and kind of like finished it up, and it's just like absolutely atrocious. No one cared about this movie. It didn't do well at all. He was trying to make a buck off of somebody else's unfinished movie. This one did not work. Okay, then the third gore movie, and what people call the Blood Trilogy. So here we have Color Me Blood Red. I like this one. It's not good per se, but in this one we have a man who is an artist, and he is painting paintings using blood of his victims. It starts out as an accident. He runs out of red paint, and he goes and he kills someone. And so gross. He takes her intestines out and squirts her blood onto his palette. Makes paintings with it. His paintings do really well. And in the beginning, he's like a struggling artist, struggling to sell his paintings. And then people love this painting that he paints with blood. And then he refuses to sell it. Then he makes more and puts those on display, and then refuses to sell those too. So people admire them, but he doesn't sell them. There's also a scene where he like cuts a woman's face and like squishes her whole face against the canvas. I like this movie mainly because the guy playing the artist is an insane person. None of the people in any of these movies are real actors, by the way. They do reoccur in Herschell Gordon Lewis's movies, but they don't really ever appear in other movies that he doesn't direct. This guy, he was also in Moonshine Mountain, which I didn't put a thing up for because it's not a horror movie. It's also not good. But Herschell Gordon Lewis did this other movie, Moonshine Mountain, about moonshine and rednecks. But anyway, this guy is crazy. He like screams. He flips out in the movie a bunch of times. And you don't see that much emotion really in most of these movies. So I like that he was really flipping out and acting like a crazy person. So that's Color Me Blood Red. Then he and Friedman parted ways. That's the last one that David Friedman produced. After that, Herschell Gordon Lewis tried all sorts of different things. He tried other kinds of movies like that Moonshine Mountain and all sorts of stuff. It was all terrible. There's no entertainment value in it if you're watching it in 2020, in my opinion. But at the time, it was stuff that people really weren't seeing in other places. And of course, media wasn't saturated. You didn't have that many movies coming out, really, compared to today. You didn't have Netflix, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have VHS, you didn't have movie stores. So it's basically, if you wanted to go see a movie, you're going to the drive-in, you're going to the theater. You might catch one on TV back then, but it's not like you could record them and then watch them whenever you wanted. So, anyway, a couple of years later, we get A Taste of Blood. Actually, that's not accurate. We got 1963, 1965, 1965. And I believe this one was 1966 or 7 or 5. I should have it memorized, but all these things, the numbers get mixed up to me. So anyway, here we go. This is 1967 for sure. A Taste of Blood. This is Herschell Gordon Lewis attempting to do a movie with somewhat of a plot and not just straight gore. Okay, the story idea is cool. It's about a man who is a relative of Count Dracula. And the last one of his elder relatives die, and so he inherits a special wine, and he inherits everything that belonged to Count Dracula. He drinks the wine and turns into a vampire himself, okay? So this is actually unique. Then the next part is that he has to go and kill every single relative of all the other characters of the original Dracula story, like Van Helsing and Dr. Seward and Jonathan Harker. There's 6 relatives of 6 characters of the original Dracula that he has to go kill. And instead of being like a 60 or 70 minute movie like all of the Gore movies, this one is 2 full hours. And it's 2 hours of bad acting, bad effects, a lot less gore than we've seen in the others, which just makes it very boring. It gets like, some props for attempting to be like a real horror movie instead of just like a gore exploitation movie, but it doesn't work out very well. So, then we have a return to gore, The Gruesome Twosome, probably the most disgusting movie that Herschell Gordon Lewis did. This one is about a mother and a severely intellectually disabled son who capture women, cut off their scalps, and then use their hair to make wigs, and then they sell the wigs to other people in town. So, it's basically, this one, in my opinion, this one is really bad because you have scenes of explicit gore, and then in between that, you have like basically just filler. You have a scene of people like dancing on the beach for 3 or 4 minutes. You have a scene of people making out in a car for like 3 or 4 minutes. You have a scene of characters who do not appear anywhere else in the movie that are sitting at a kitchen table or a dining room table, and you never even see their faces, and it's just the woman telling the man how much she likes him, and the man just eating and refusing to participate in the conversation. And in fact, he's not even eating the whole time, he's just like squishing fruits and squishing potato chips in his hands. It's totally pointless. They just were trying, basically, I believe Herschell Gordon Lewis wasn't doing too well on his movie endeavors that weren't gore, and so he tried to just make another gore movie, but really couldn't figure out a plot. So it's just bad. It's just really bad. Okay. So people get their scalps cut off. People get stabbed. There's an electric knife that is used. Eyeballs get popped out. It's really disgusting and has almost no value other than the gore factor, which at this point, as far as I know, I haven't really seen any other 60s gore-filled movies. It didn't really catch on, so he kept putting them out. Once we get to the 70s, everything is way more explicit. But in the 60s, we have a lot of Hammer films that I've watched dozens of, and most of them aren't that explicit. There's other movies in the 60s, of course, but some of them are black and white. Some of them are just really low budget, and the ones that aren't low budget are tasteful. So he's got this gore market cornered, so he keeps putting them out. Anyway, there's a 3-year gap between this and his next gore movie, but then he did something weird, which again seems like it's supposed to be like a real horror movie. It's about a witch, about an ugly witch that appears to a man as a beautiful woman, and he like falls in love with her, but then like whenever he goes to have sex with her, she's an ugly witch. Kind of funny, but the acting is horrible, and it kind of drags on. And again, there's no real gore in this one. It's just like a witchy movie, and it doesn't have the talent behind it to make it actually entertaining. This movie inspired Something Weird Video, and they put out lots of weirdo, super underground movies like Something Weird. In fact, I've got the DVD right over here. Let me grab it for you. So here you go. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. All right, Something Weird, put out by Something Weird Video. Okay. So we've got that. I might as well show you. I've got my whole little Herschell Gordon Lewis collection here. Here's a wonderful version of 2000 Maniacs that the features on there are worth that purchase. Watching Herschell Gordon Lewis talk is excellent. I also grabbed Color Me Blood Red because I couldn't find these to stream or rent anywhere. I got Taste of Blood, Something Weird Video. And I also found this, Blood Feast 2, which is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. I couldn't finish it even though I bought it. Blood Feast 2 didn't come out until like 2002. It's actually worse than the original Blood Feast. I think they tried to make it bad on purpose, but it's just horribly, horribly bad. And watching someone do a bad gore movie in the 60s is a lot more interesting than watching someone do a bad gore movie in 2002, because it had been done a million times by then. Okay, going forward, this is not a horror movie, but I actually liked this more than most of his horror movies. This is called She-Devils on Wheels. In the late 60s, there was a brief boom in motorcycle gang movies, and this is the first ever female motorcycle gang movie done by Herschell Gordon Lewis. He had to choose between finding actresses that he could teach to ride motorcycles and finding a real gang of motorcycle girls that he could try and teach to act. Well, he didn't really teach them to act, they just kind of like said their lines. But they were real motorcycle women, and I think they were really a motorcycle gang. And at the end, we get an awesome decapitation where they set up this line and they get this guy to chase them, and then the guy is on a motorcycle and he doesn't see the line because it's really thin, it's like a wire, and his head gets cut off and flies through the air. It's actually great. It's actually probably the best gore sequence in any of Herschell Gordon Lewis's movies, and it's not even a gore movie. So that is She-Devils on Wheels. I think that came out in 68. Pretty sure 1968. Okay, 2 years later we get the 1970 entry, The Wizard of Gore. And now it's 1970, so he did get a little bit better at this. This is probably my second favorite Herschell Gordon Lewis gore movie after 2000 Maniacs. In this one, another interesting premise. He's good with the ideas, but the actual screenplays aren't great, and the acting is usually bad. The acting was a little bit better in this one than an average Lewis movie. Anyway, it's about a magician who does tricks on stage, such as cut people in half, which is pretty normal, except instead of putting the audience member in a box, he just puts her on a table, and instead of using a handsaw, he uses a chainsaw, and he really cuts her in half. I mean, he doesn't really cut her in half, but what really happened was they put a whole bunch of sheep's organs on her, and he chainsaws the sheep's organs, so it's absolutely disgusting. There's all sorts of crazy kills in this movie, if you want to use that word. He sticks swords down women's throats. What else does he puts a spike through a girl's head, which you can kind of see down here. This one was crazy. He puts this this industrial press into a woman's stomach, and it's so disgusting. They put all these sheep's intestines and all of this stuff on the table, and they swirl it all around and just smash it with this real industrial press. My favorite part is actually in the beginning when the Wizard of Gore cuts off his own head, and it's pretty crazy. Also, in the plot, the Wizard of Gore is actually a wizard. Like, he does actual magic in it. He raises graves out of a graveyard. It's pretty crazy. Some of the editing is really bad. Like, 1 second there's blood, another second there's no blood, then another second there is blood. And the thing is, after he does these tricks, the women get up and walk away, and then like 5 hours later there's like a delayed reaction, and then they die of the thing. Like, the girl who gets sawed in half goes to a bar, she looks fine, and then like next thing you know, all her intestines are hanging out and she's like sawed in half. So it's pretty interesting. It's not really well like shot because the editing is very poor. And the actor that played the wizard actually quit after a few days, so they just got one of the guys from the crew to play that main actor. But actually, he was great. I mean, as great by standards of a Herschell Gordon Lewis movie. He acted better than most of the other actors in the other movies. So, that's The Wizard of Gore. That is one of our final entries of 1970. There's only a few movies left, and most of them I can't find. I've got one person who thinks he might be able to find some of them for me, so this might be the final one. And there's also a Czechoslovakian fantasy political commentary movie that appeared in one horror list. So I'm going to give that one a watch. Oh, and we also have Equinox, which we're going to do soon. So we got one or two more left, and then we're going to do a little wrap-up. So thanks for sticking with me. If you want to watch a Herschell Gordon Lewis movie for the first time, I suggest you start with 2000 Maniacs. It's the best one and the easiest one to stomach. And then if you can handle that, you can try Blood Feast or Wizard of Gore, but they're pretty tough to watch. All right. See you next time.